This presentation, I'll talk about suburban and traditional local street design. Traditional is also known by some other terms, particularly when it's done in newer developments, such as new urbanism or neo-traditional. So I'll use those terms somewhat interchangeably. So suburban will be one, and then traditional, neo-traditional, new urbanism, and really the focus on local street design and some of the related topics or issues around local streets, primarily where we're connecting people with where they live. Many miles of local streets are built each year, and there is controversy between these two competing design philosophies, looking at suburban and traditional. And there's trade-offs probably with both, and we'll talk about some of the issues and concerns with these. So starting with some definitions, it's important that we're talking about the same thing. So the suburban experiment, as it's defined by Strong Towns, is an approach to growth and development that was dominant in North America in the 20th century. And the two distinguishing characteristics that differentiate it from traditional development is new growth happens at a large scale, and construction is done to a finished state, and there's no further growth anticipated after initial construction. I'll talk also about some of the other characteristics that are typical of suburban developments, but this is kind of our general definition we'll be operating from. On the traditional development pattern side, this is an approach and development that humans have used for thousands of years across different cultures, continents, and latitudes. There are two distinguishing characteristics for this type of development as well that differentiate it from suburban, and those are growth happens incrementally over time, and all neighborhoods are on a continuum of improvement. So those are very broad definitions, and we'll get into some of the more specific characteristics of each. So thinking about the specific problem when we're talking about local street design, it's been facilitated primarily for vehicular travel, particularly personal vehicles, which has reduced the ability for active travel, particularly for children and elderly or anybody else with mobility issues who may not be able to drive. The built environment can have significant impact on health. So it's important, and that's why we need to be aware of the impact it has on people and our societies. Your built environment can be structured in a way that give people more opportunities and choices to be physically active or fewer. Residents of walkable communities are twice as likely to meet physical activity guidelines as those who don't live in walkable neighborhoods. Children with neighborhoods that lack access to parks, playgrounds, and recreation have a 20 to 45% greater risk of becoming overweight. And in general, states with the highest levels of biking and walking have the lowest levels of obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes. So these are all things and part of the context about the importance of our local infrastructure, local street design, and how we build our neighborhoods and communities. In 2021, more than 7,300 pedestrians died in the U.S. 3 and 4 of them were during the hours between sunset and sunrise. So if you look at this graph, you can kind of see how the changing time through the year of darkness, both at dusk and dawn, change. And those are our spikes in the peak number of pedestrian fatalities. There are a lot of things that are wrapped up in this. It can be an exposure thing. So there are more pedestrians that are walking in the morning and in the evenings coming to or from work or school or other activities. But we see this as a big problem, and our roadways can contribute to this, can help this. And we want to be aware of speeds, the type of design that we provide for all of our users, and think about how that may affect safety and overall fatality rates. Walk score has been something that's got a lot of attention, typically has been shown to lead to higher walk scores, contribute to higher property values, lead to the creation of bike facilities, public transit, or other kind of non-car dependent features that boost the score and boost property values in a particular location. The nice thing about this is it's easy for users to understand. It promotes the consideration of alternative modes by home buyers. But what I'd encourage you to do at this point, pause the video and go to walk score. Look for the address you're currently living, look for a previous address, maybe look for an address that you would like to live, and see how those walk scores vary and see if they reflect the reality of what you think is walkable or not. Of course, there's things that are missing and little nuances that this tool isn't going to capture, but it is putting some tool in people's hands to think about how their location may be or may not be walkable. So take a minute to do that and think about how that score is. I put a location here on Western Boulevard to give us some context for possible scores. It's a pretty good score, and the more you move into suburban and rural areas, typically the walk score is going to go down and higher in more urban areas where there's more access to amenities and businesses. Another thing to also think about, and I love this terminology about walk uphill. So it's not just what's your walk score and are there sidewalks, are there facilities to do it, but is it a place you actually want to walk? And so there's some good language around surrounding this. And if you look on the left, we've got a typical suburban arterial type of design. And most people probably aren't going to feel comfortable in this location. And comparing that same area to a traditional European city where everything is much more dense, much more walkable, much more at a human scale, and not really optimized for vehicles, is going to be something to think about. Are your facilities going to be something that people want to use and want to travel with? So here's an example on the other end of the spectrum, a great street, looking at those options. This is one that you can imagine this would be a place that would probably have a lot of activity, would be someplace you would want to walk. Here's another one, so just a little bit lower on the scale, but still a very highly appealing place to walk. Here's a neighborhood street. Here's a suburban street. And again, we're working our way down on the walk uphill of these. Now we're on a subdivision street, so probably not many good destinations here. Very homogeneous land uses, all single family residential homes. So not many places for people to go here. So maybe not a terrible place to walk for recreation, but maybe not a great place for others for transportation. We keep working our way down. This is a parking lot, and the 100 feet here and the distances that are shown are distances that people may be willing to walk. And a lot of times, let me actually go back to some of our earlier versions of these higher walk scores. So in this type of environment, people may walk miles. And a lot of people, when they travel to a very walkable European city, when they come back, they say, oh, I walked 6 or 8 or 10 miles every day, and they're in very walkable locations. And so it doesn't feel like it's that long of a walk. As the walk uphill goes down, maybe it's only 3/4 of a mile in this kind of main street format. And then as we get to a neighborhood street, people are maybe walking 1/4 of a mile. Then in the suburban street, 1/10 of a mile. A subdivision street, people only want to walk 250 feet. Most people want to pull into their driveways, and they're not going to be doing much walking along a subdivision street, particularly for transportation. There's differences if you're walking for recreational purposes or exercise, and then for transportation purposes as well. A parking lot, a lot of people, you're going to try and park as close as you can, and 100 feet is all you may want to walk in this type of environment. Think about those higher speed, higher volume arterials. There may be a sidewalk there, but it may not be a very appealing place to walk. You're kind of sandwiched in between multiple lanes of high speed, high volume traffic, and then parking lots on your other side, not much shade. If you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to think about how it may fit into our infrastructure, and you can also look into more details about walk uphill and do some of that research on your own. Let's take a look at some of the designs that we're going to talk more about. So we'll do a little drive through here. This is a suburban neighborhood street design. And so we're driving along here. These are very typical in North American, United States communities. You're going to have a driveway on the street side that connects in, and all your services are there. So you see the mailboxes, trash cans usually will be picked up. There's some that we see on the right here. On-street parking is typical. All this development typically done at once. cul-de-sacs are pretty common. So we see a cul-de-sac in front of us here, so they don't connect into other developments. Lots of uniformity and homogeneous designs within the residential structures here. And again, this could be any number of suburban home developments. Let's take a look also now at a neo-traditional design. And this one's not far from that first location. And the main thing here, so this is an alleyway. So there's an alleyway where you're going to access all your services, your garage, typically trash. Here, the mailboxes are in the front. There is some on-street parking, but there's no driveway. So this is one of the great benefits of this neo-traditional design. If you look at that sidewalk and thinking about walking and walking with kids, there's an uninterrupted sidewalk for long distances where there's no vehicle conflicts at the driveway. So there's no driveways on this part of the road. It's the driveways and homes and garages are accessed through the alleyway. So nice compact fronts to the homes, small front yards. And this isn't a mandatory thing, but it is something that does happen regularly with this type of design. We're pushing those homes up. It makes it more walkable. Thinking back of those walk uphill, we want to fill the human scale. We don't want these wide open spaces that feel like they're more meant for vehicles and not for people. So now we're kind of turning right here and going to go down an alleyway to see where those services are accessed. And again, those kind of less desirable from an aesthetics perspective are all at the back of the home. So this is a street that most people wouldn't drive down unless you're going to your home. Here we see the garages. Architects, I think, really like this design to hide those garage doors where they're not the focal point of the home, and the front of the home is actually what you're going to see. And we see the trash cans here. So all those services and activities are going to happen at the back of the home. Related to this, there's something called the Marchetti constant. And this was developed by an Italian physicist to talk about the bounds of a city and how transportation affected that. And the idea has been for human history, there's been a 30-minute rule about how far people are willing to travel each way to work. It's not always fits, but generally that's the guideline. So 30 minutes would be the commute time in ancient Athens, and that would be when people would be walking to their jobs. In Kansas City, 30 minutes of transit 100 years ago to commute to your job. Today, it's more of 30 minutes driving. And what has happened is those distances have caused and resulted in our cities having a much larger footprint and much more sprawling. When everything is walking, when you only can travel 30 minutes for walking, that's a much smaller city size than if you're doing transit or if you're doing single vehicle occupancy, personal automobiles to travel to the locations you're going to. So an interesting concept, and we do see it playing over and over again in different locations with different modes, and the importance that those transportation modes and technologies have on developments of our cities. So here's an image of a standard suburban type development. This began roughly in the mid 1800s and really was the dominant philosophy, particularly in the US from after World War II for the next 50 plus years. And in some areas, it still is the dominant philosophy. We're still building them. It's based on a functional class system where you have your local streets here that then tie into collectors and arterials. High design standards, typically single developer subdivisions that don't tie into other developments and subdivisions. They only tie to that collector or arterial road. A lot of the features are over designed, large design vehicles, large curb radii, and as a result, high design speeds and operating speeds. In neighborhoods, there's constant complaints, particularly in this suburban type development, of speeds. The one on the image here I'm actually familiar with, and they have made several requests for traffic calming and for dynamic speed signs to tell people what their speeds are, wide streets, which typically encourage higher speeds, a branching street pattern where it ties into the kind of one main street instead of a grid pattern, typically a single subdivision entrance, a lot of T intersections and cul-de-sacs. All the public services are at the edge of the street. Some of these do have sidewalks, but some don't. Each home has its own single family. Each single family home typically has its own driveway. And it really was dominant because market forces, there was a desire for these large lots, particularly after World War II. It was largely easy to develop. You're doing a lot of property at once, a lot of kind of clear cutting and removing the existing vegetation and terrain in order to build this all at the same time. Zoning regulations really favored suburban development, and in most places still do favor suburban development. There was a thought that old cities were dirty, they were industrial, and you wanted to separate those land uses. So keep the housing separated from the commercial areas, separated from industrial areas, separated from recreational areas. So everything was separate and kind of in its own box. The design standards were set and the zoning standards were set, and it's just easy to follow what's been done there. And it's often difficult to do something else. It's often seen as an efficient use of public and developer resources. And for a long time, there was no real alternative philosophy to follow. This led to a lot of problems. The auto dominance is because there's low density and it's hard for efficient transit in these types of areas. There's lots of congestion because of single entrances and no redundancy. So if there's only one entrance and exit to a development, everyone's got to go that way. You're putting usually a lot of traffic onto collectors and arterials, even if the distance isn't far between adjacent communities that people may be interested in going in. I'll show in a little while one of the famous examples of how you can have neighbors that may be a long distance from each other. Some people see this as a lack of safety when you live near high-speed streets, or when the roads are designed in such a way that people can travel at a very high rate of speed. I hear a lot of people talking about a loss of neighborhood feeling, and it's unfortunate that there's not many more alternatives, particularly from a transportation perspective, for people who don't have a driver's license or a vehicle. So this is the famous example. These are backyard neighbors. And the question here is how far, if you have to drive, so if there's something you can't pass it over the fence and they have to, for some reason, need to drive from one house to the next, how far is it? So I'm going to pause for just a second. Think about how far it could be the shortest path to get from driveway to driveway driving. Okay, this is in Florida, so there's some water features that do affect things. But to me, shockingly, this 7 miles is the closest way to get from one driveway to the next. And these are people who share a common fence in their backyard. So I think this is a good example of the lack of connectivity. We see a lot of these single developer developments where they're not connecting with other neighborhoods. Pointing out maybe another specific area, this is in northern Wake County near Raleigh, Wake Forest. Current population is probably around 40,000. It's grown tremendously in recent years. And in 93, we can see lots of farms. You can even see the names on a lot of these current developments are showing up in this 1993 image here. And then here it is in 2014. So about 20 years, a huge increase in the number of residential developments in this community. Sprawl is something that gets a lot of attention. There's a lot of information about the costs of infrastructure, public service delivery, and transportation, and the extra costs that the commuters and people who live in areas that have a lot of sprawl need to pay just to function in their daily life of traveling between homes, businesses, services, jobs. Lots of considerations and things that we should be thinking about. Also leads to food deserts. In some instances, the more we have sprawl, we have certain communities, typically in lower income areas, that may have a larger distance to the nearest supermarket. This map is showing areas that are more than 1 mile from the nearest supermarket. And in 2010, that was 10% of the US population lived in areas at least a mile from the nearest supermarket. And that means often buying food at stores that are closer by that have less healthy food products and options. Retailers sometimes are discouraged from locating in low-income areas due to insufficient demand, and the poverty can prevent residents of these areas from attaining lower priced and better quality products. Moving into some discussion about traditional examples, traditional neighborhoods. Lots of pre-World War II neighborhoods fit in this traditional definition. Lots of new ones: Seaside, Florida Celebration, close to Raleigh, Wade Park, Southern Village and Meadowmont and Chapel Hill, Falls River and Carpenter Village in Wake County. Lots of good examples. These are, again, largely look like this pre-World War II style neighborhood where the pedestrians rule and the automobiles are guests. Today, these new neo-traditional or new urbanism types of design often need zoning variances and design standard changes for many of these aspects that are common design features of traditional. There's a reaction against the suburban philosophy and some of its problems, and that's why we see traditional making a comeback. Some of it's just nostalgia for pre-World War II small towns and streetcar neighborhoods, and thinking about this concept of 15-minute cities really fits well with these traditional types of developments. Demographics are changing, aging populations, lots of dual income, no kid households, baby boomers aging, fitness consciousness. Being in a walkable place is becoming more and more desirable. Often traditional is the opposite of suburban: smaller design vehicles, smaller curb radii, which leads to lower design speeds and lower operating speeds, narrow streets, a grid pattern that's really resilient and redundant. If something is blocked on one street on your grid, you just simply go to the next one and make your turn there. Often many entrances and intersections, no cul-de-sacs, the public services are in the alley, sidewalks on both sides, no driveways across those sidewalks, which are really great for pedestrians and bicyclists to not have to worry about those driveway entrances at every home. Here's an example off of Hillsborough Street in Raleigh of a pre-World War II type neighborhood. It's just a really nice neighborhood, and looking at it at first, it seems like it's very similar to any neighborhood, and then you realize, oh, there's no driveways here. There's alleyways behind these homes, and that's how the services are there. So no conflicts with the sidewalks and pedestrians that may be traveling there. This is a newer example. This is actually the development that I showed in the video. We can see the street here that we watched the video on, and then we turned this way to go down the alleyway, and that's where all the services were, is down that alley. So this is an example of a neo-traditional development. Here's another one. This is Carpenter Village that I mentioned previously. A mix of housing types here. We can see it kind of looks like a small town where you've got a concentration of some community assets here in the center, a park area, a pool, some retail. There's also multifamily housing and single family housing with more density closer to your community assets. Here's an example. The top is the front of the homes, and then the bottom image is the alleyway where you would actually access those services. So that's what this type of neo-traditional design may look like. There was some research from 2005 that compared some of these, so conventional neighborhoods in Orange County with a neo-traditional neighborhood, Southern Village. And so we can see the first thing we see here is the conventional suburban design only has homes. It's all residential. The neo-traditional is mixing in some other land uses here. So providing some of those amenities, the goal being that everyone won't have to leave to go get everything they need, the services they need. Maybe there's some job opportunities within their own community. So here's the case study information. So relatively similar number of housing units, a little bit smaller on the new urbanist side, 676 to 1,030. The area is half the size though, so the units per acre is higher in your neo-urbanist neighborhood. The number of single-family dwelling density is higher as well. Street density is a little bit higher, but fairly similar. more connectedness. So there's a higher number of 3- and 4-way intersections per area. The block length is much smaller, so that makes it much more walkable. More commercial space and more jobs in the neighborhood for these 2 case studies. Here's information for both the neo-traditional and the conventional, and this is comparing also to the Triangle Regional Survey for a little extra data point here to compare to the general population. So the household size, vehicles is about the same, a little bit lower. These are still people who live in a largely suburban type area, even though their development is not as much suburban. We do see a slight reduction in total trips, and I think this is a significant reduction in the number of vehicle trips. So 7.4 compared to 9.3 on average. For less travel distance, about the same travel duration, lower regional trips, and fewer external trips as well. So these are some of the metrics to compare these 2 designs and developments. This is looking at the trips that are internal versus external. So in our neo-traditional, there's opportunity for more trips inside the neighborhood because there are some commercial and retail opportunities within the neighborhood. Less so in the conventional neighborhood. So these are probably just people visiting each other, maybe taking kids to a friend's house or so forth. And a lot higher representation on private vehicles in our conventional neighborhood, the external trips compared to our external trips in the neo-traditional, and the same for within the neighborhood. Actually, there are a substantial number of people that are driving, but the total number of trips are higher. So there's a trade-off there. In this example, there are people driving within that neo-traditional neighborhood, but they're going to be driving shorter distances, and there's a lot more internal trips to that neighborhood compared to conventional. So, which philosophy works better? It depends. I don't think it depends on what your metrics are in terms of which one you may think it's better. There's some shift to other modes in the traditional, not huge, but if there's more and more opportunities for staying within a community, and also if you're working from home and then you can have lunch within the community and grocery shopping and those kind of things, that may have a different impact than what these studies from 2005 showed. Safety, there's probably good information from both at this point. Anecdotes both ways as well, but certainly the lower design speeds, lower volumes of the neo-traditional should have a safety impact. Travel time is going to be typically higher in a neighborhood for traditional because there's slower speeds, more connectivity, and that has some trade-offs, but you're hopefully removing some of those vehicles from surrounding arterials. That's where you're really going to see the impact in suburban areas, is you're quickly funneling traffic from your local streets onto your arterials. Mode split is going to have an impact on this as well. Construction cost, traditional is typically higher. There's more overhead for this, but it means there's also more lots and units that are per area, per land area available to sell. Market values, the traditional prices seem to be rising more quickly than suburban. And there's probably many other metrics you can think of and may want to compare between the 2 design philosophies. Here's a summary of some of the dimensional values from ITE about lots and setbacks and other things, comparing the suburban and traditional design philosophies here. Often, and we should be thinking about these together, land use and transportation are very closely linked. They affect each other. Often a problem in one creates a problem in another. So on the left, we see that suburban design, single family or single developer development. where in order to go to the school, there's not good connectivity. And so you're putting vehicles on the arterial compared to a traditional design. If you can provide access that's redundant, that can be within the neighborhood, you can alleviate some of the issues and congestion that you see on arterials. And again, for traffic engineers, the big thing are those left turns. So anytime we can avoid putting a vehicle on an arterial that needs to turn left, we're going to save ourselves some improve our operational efficiency. Another thing related to auto-centric design is that we end up with a lot of road and parking facilities. This is an example in Sacramento, California, that road and parking facilities cover 28% of the land area in residential areas and 68% in commercial areas. So we're spending a lot of our land, we're dedicating it to our vehicles, either the movement of our vehicles or the storage of our vehicles while we're visiting that land use. And these are similar numbers that we see across the country. 35% is an average from a study on residential areas that's dedicated to parking and roads, and 50 to 70% in most non-residential areas. So we do spend a lot of our land, use a lot of our land for this. And it also has a cost. I mean, there's a cost to construct parking. Parking is not free. Paid parking is the best policy to have. It's not free to build, maintain parking, so we should be paying for the parking that we use. Those are in my opinion, the better policies. And thinking about how much the land costs, how much the construction costs, what are the operations and maintenance costs, they go up the more structures you need. So if you need a parking garage, underground or above ground, those are a much different cost perspective than on street. On street also has a cost though. You're also dedicating roadway space or infrastructure space. Perhaps those could go to other modes. If we have room for parking, could we have room for bicycle and pedestrian transportation as well? Okay, in this on a little bit of a lighter note, possibly. I always think this information is interesting. Take a minute and just think about what are the most popular street names. Pause this for a second if you need to, but come up with a list in your head. What do you think are the most popular street names? Second is the top. This is always to me interesting and counterintuitive somewhat until you realize First Street is sometimes called First Street, but it's also sometimes called Main Street. And so that's why we see First Street down in 3rd and Main Street in 7th, is because we basically split those. So 2nd Street is the most popular street name, followed by 3rd Street. And then we also see a lot of nature terms here. So with park in the name, or oak, or maple, or cedar. There's some compass directions in the list as well. Famous individuals, Washington. So George Washington being the most famous individual and most common street name in the US. This is another interesting one that I thought. Different cities kind of organize their streets, drives, boulevards, avenues, and in different areas, different geographies. Here's an example you see in San Francisco. The yellow here are streets. We've got boulevards, drives, avenues. Here's another one looking at Houston and seeing that mix of the different names for calling lanes, drives, parkways, streets, roads, highways, interstates, freeways. Lots of options here, and I thought it was just a neat way to visualize this. Here's some resources. A video on a TED Talk for making cities more walkable. For those of you in North Carolina, the NC Department of Commerce, Designing Better Places, is another resource on this topic. Look forward to hearing your comments and having further discussions on this topic.